Joanna Dennehy is a British serial killer who, in the space of just 10 days in March 2013, stabbed 3 men to death and tried to murder 2 others before she was stopped. She later said she had planned to kill 9 men in total. Dennehy is one of only 2 women currently serving prison sentences in the UK who will never be released, the other being Rose West, who, along with her husband Fred, murdered at least 10 young women between 1973 and 1987 in Gloucester. The reason why Joanna Dennehy will spend the rest of her life in prison is the nature of her crimes, her lack of remorse, and her narcissism, with her describing herself as, quote, a fully committed psychopath. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Joanna Christine Dennehy was born in August 1982 and grew up near the city of St Albans in Hertfordshire. She was raised by her mother Kathleen, her father Kevin, and she also had a sister Maria. I've looked into various reports and articles and can find no evidence of neglect or abuse in her childhood. In fact, it appears that Dennehy was raised in a loving and stable home. She did well at primary school and seemed to have a promising future, and she showed interest in becoming a lawyer. However, all that changed when Dennehy became a teenager and she began to rebel, and this included drinking alcohol and taking drugs in the company of criminals. Despite attempts by her parents to boundary her behaviour, Dennehy would run away from home, and she did this on at least 8 occasions between the ages of 15 and 16 years old. She would spend her time drinking and taking drugs with her negative peers and engaging in sexual activity with adult men and women. At around the age of 16, Dennehy met 21-year-old John Treanor whilst he was out walking his dog, and the pair began a volatile on-off relationship which lasted for the next 12 years. The pair had 2 daughters, including Cheyenne, who was born in 1999 when Dennehy was aged 17. Cheyenne later described happy memories of her mother initially, before her life descended into chaos, with her stating during an interview in 2019 that she recalled, quote, "My mum would love to read. She was always on the sofa reading a book, and she would go out on long walks. She loved Mr. Darcy. She read Pride and Prejudice. She would talk to me about it all the time. She'd do papier-mâché art with me and my friends." However, Cheyenne was also a witness to the change in her mother as she became an alcoholic and addicted to drugs, with her recounting, quote, "She'd gone out drinking. In the middle of the night she sent a man to beat up my dad. It was terrifying. I was about 5 and I'd woken up and I heard this shouting. There was this man outside shouting at my dad. He said, 'Joe has sent me here because you've done this,' but I didn't know what. My dad shouted at me to go back to bed, so I did. I didn't know what had happened after that, but I was petrified. My mum would just come home after being away for so long and she'd have a black eye from a fight. She'd disappear for days on end, sometimes for months. She would come home and she would have cuts all over her, or she'd been cheating and she'd have love bites and she'd have to hide it with a scarf." As time progressed, Dennehy showed complete indifference to the welfare of her children and would leave John to raise them. John later stated that he was fearful of Dennehy's volatility, with her regularly cutting herself across the stomach in front of him, and she would often sit at the breakfast table drinking spirits. Dennehy would regularly carry knives, and he recalled one occasion in 2009 when she returned home drunk, pulled a knife out of her boot, and plunged it into the living room floor, yelling, quote, "I wish I could kill someone." Soon afterwards, John took the children and fled, with them having no contact with Dennehy until they saw the news articles about her crime spree. Prior to the murders, Dennehy was known to the police and had served time in prison for burglary. In 2012, the year before the murders, she was arrested for theft and had a psychological assessment. She was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder as well as underlying psychopathic traits. She was described as a woman who was manipulative, lacking in any remorse for her behaviour, and prone to rage, impulsivity, violence, and explosive outbursts of anger. Dennehy was prescribed antipsychotic medication to try and manage her mental health issues. Before getting to the murders themselves, it's necessary to look at Dennehy's accomplices and her apparent allure to men in her life. 3 men eventually appeared in the dock with Dennehy when she was eventually sentenced, but I wish to focus on the main 2. Firstly, Gary Stretch, formerly Gary Richards, a hulking 7'3" man who was apparently besotted with Dennehy and, as will be returned to later, even whilst awaiting his fate, still professed his undying love and devotion to her. He was a man with below average intelligence and a long criminal record of offences motivated by money, including burglaries and robberies, and he seemed to be a man without any real purpose in life, who, at the age of 47, was living in dilapidated accommodation and had little real stake in society. The other man, 37-year-old Leslie Layton, didn't have a long criminal record, but was similarly rudderless in life and was enamoured with Dennehy. At the eventual court case, it was pointed out that both men were 2 of many individuals who Dennehy had under her spell. It's not explicitly stated why this was the case, but it appears that Dennehy would target disenfranchised and often vulnerable individuals who existed on the fringes of society. She paid attention to them, which I think made them feel special, and the superficial charm associated with her psychopathy likely made them think she genuinely had feelings for them. It appears that sex was a particular weapon in her arsenal, with her sleeping with men to form connections with them. It seems that these men found being around Dennehy exciting, with them revelling in her behaviour, and eventually her infamy. However, any outward expressions of attention or affection were Dennehy's way of manipulating those around her, including these men, in order to obtain drink, drugs, accommodation, and eventually to have accomplices in her killing spree. In January 2013, Dennehy, by this point aged 30, met 48-year-old Kevin Lee in the town of Peterborough in the county of Cambridgeshire. Kevin rented out cheap rooms to vulnerable people, and the 2 soon began a sexual relationship. Dennehy was able to live rent-free and acted as Kevin's, quote, enforcer, threatening people who had not paid their rent and other debts. So you have Dennehy in an environment where she could manipulate and abuse. With Kevin Lee, she used sex as a way to get what she wanted, in this case a roof over her head. She spun him lies to gain his sympathy, including claiming that she'd been abused as a child by her father and she'd eventually murdered him. None of this is true. With regards to her role as an enforcer, I've no doubt that Dennehy enjoyed victimising and abusing vulnerable people, likely finding the terror she instilled in them exhilarating. It was also around this time that Dennehy stopped taking her antipsychotic medication. Joanna Dennehy's first victim was Lukasz Slabozewski, a 31-year-old Polish national who had issues with drink and drugs and who lived close to Dennehy. How and where the 2 met is unclear, but it's believed that Dennehy only knew Lukasz for a matter of days before murdering him. However, even during this short time, he was clearly smitten as he had texted a friend of his about his, quote, English girlfriend. On or around the 19th of March 2013, it's believed that Lukasz was lured to Dennehy's property with the promise of sex, and when he stepped in, was attacked. He was killed with a single stab wound to the heart. Dennehy then, treating this man's remains as garbage, put his body in a wheelie bin whilst figuring out what to do with him. However, Dennehy could not contain her excitement and glee about what she'd done, so Dennehy invited a 14-year-old girl she knew to the property, specifically to show her Lukasz's body in the wheelie bin. Dennehy then borrowed money from Kevin Lee and purchased a Vauxhall Astra and travelled by taxi with Gary Stretch to collect it. This was around the 21st of March 2013. The pair then drove around Peterborough with Lukasz's body in the boot and eventually dumped it off Thorney Dyke, a rural road which was near to where Stretch had lived some years before. The second victim was John Chapman, a 56-year-old vulnerable man who was a housemate of Dennehy's. Chapman was a man who'd served his country in the Royal Navy, but his life had deteriorated due to his issues with alcohol and he'd fallen on hard times. However, he was described as a, quote, kindly, harmless and inoffensive man, and Joanna Dennehy took full advantage of this. In the days before his murder, Dennehy, Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton were drinking in his property. However, it seems there was an issue with John's tenancy and he'd been served with an eviction notice, and it was Dennehy's job to get him out, and she bragged to others she would do this by any means possible. John Chapman is believed to have been murdered in the early hours of the 29th of March 2013, whilst asleep in his living room. His blood alcohol level was 5 times the legal limit, so he was likely almost unconscious. Dennehy then attacked John and stabbed him once in the neck, severing his carotid artery, and 5 times in the chest, with 2 of these stab wounds passing through his heart. All of the wounds were delivered with considerable force. There were no defensive injuries on John's body, indicating that he likely died almost instantly, and thankfully had little idea what was going on. Dennehy then used John's mobile phone to call Gary Stretch to tell him what she had done. She also called Leslie Layton, who, rather than being horrified when he saw the scene in front of him, decided to take a photograph of John's dead body. Dennehy then went out shopping with a friend, without a care in the world, leaving John Chapman's body lying on his floor. The third murder was that of Kevin Lee, the man who'd taken Joanna Dennehy in. Why he was killed is unclear, but it seems likely he was just a convenient victim to be able to satisfy Dennehy's ever-growing bloodlust. He too was killed on the 29th of March 2013. He was lured to the property with suggestive text messages promising him sex, which he discussed just an hour before going to her property with a friend. When he went to Dennehy's property, she attacked him, stabbing him 5 times in the chest, with his injuries piercing his heart and lungs. Kevin was found to have defensive wounds, which indicated that he fought for his life. Joanna Dennehy now had 2 dead bodies to deal with at 2 different locations, and employed the help of both Layton and Stretch, who dutifully worked to help Dennehy clean up the murder scenes and dispose of the bodies. John Chapman's body was driven and dumped mere yards from the body of Lukas Slabozewski, which has still not been discovered. Kevin Lee's remains were dumped in a remote rural area on the outskirts of Peterborough, called Newborough. However, Dennehy could not resist the temptation to further degrade Kevin, as if killing him was not bad enough. She dressed his corpse in a sequin dress of hers, and he was dumped wearing this, with his body being posed so that his buttocks were exposed. Dennehy took great delight, not only in killing the man who'd given her a place to live, but humiliating him even in death. She told People about the murder and was described as ecstatic. Joanna Dennehy and Gary Stretch appeared to have been under no illusions that they would eventually get caught and likely spend years, if not the rest of their lives, behind bars. But they were completely indifferent to this, with Stretch apparently laughing at this knowledge and stating, quote, "My kids are grown up, so I don't care." Joanna Dennehy and Gary Stretch then went on the run in order to get a head start on the police, and on the 2nd of April 2013 they travelled to Hereford in Hertfordshire, approximately 140 miles away from Peterborough, an area that Stretch had previously lived in. However, it's clear they had no intention of lying low and were looking to terrorise people in a whole new county. The pair committed burglaries in quick succession, and somewhere along the journey, Stretch had apparently acquired a handgun, which he proudly displayed to criminals they met up with in the Hereford area, looking for ways to sell their ill-gotten gains. This CCTV footage shows Dennehy and Stretch wandering around a supermarket hand in hand. This footage shows the sheer size of Gary Stretch, who, as already stated, was 7 foot 3 inches tall, and potentially he was armed at this point. I find footage like this so strange. You have people just going about their day-to-day life, not knowing they're walking past a woman who had murdered 3 people. Makes you think who you may pass on the street today, doesn't it? Anyway, on the 3rd of April 2013, just 24 hours after they arrived in Hereford, Dennehy had decided she wished to kill again, and she and Stretch began cruising around the roads looking for targets. This CCTV footage is chilling, as it shows Dennehy in a shop on the same road as her first random victim, with her appearing, as it was described in court later, in a state of euphoria. Approximately a minute after Dennehy left this store, she came across 63-year-old Robert Bariza, a complete stranger to her. He was a retired fireman who was out walking his dogs. Dennehy approached him from behind, pulled out a large knife and stabbed Robin in the back, and then a second time in the right arm. Robin spun round and asked Dennehy why she was doing this, with her responding, quote, "I want to hurt you. I'm going to fucking kill you." Dennehy tried to continue to attack Robin, but he fought back, and eventually she stopped the attack and climbed back into the car with Stretch, and the pair drove away. Dennehy was apparently unsatisfied with this attack and demanded that Stretch find her another victim. Using his local knowledge, Stretch parked the car near a pathway frequented by dog walkers, and they soon saw 56-year-old John Rogers walking his dog. This second attack was less than 30 minutes after the first incident, and Dennehy was determined that this man would die. Again, she approached John from behind and began to stab him repeatedly in the back. When he turned round, she repeatedly stabbed him in the stomach and chest area. When he fell, Dennehy continued to stab him repeatedly while he lay helpless on the floor. This was a frenzied and ferocious attack, during which time Dennehy stabbed John Rogers approximately 35 to 40 times. John received deep wounds to his chest, abdomen and back. Both lungs collapsed, his bowels were perforated and exposed out of his body, and he received wounds to his hands, which caused severe nerve damage. John was found by a member of the public who called the police and an ambulance, and he was rushed to hospital, and, by some miracle, he survived. However, in a cruel footnote, John Rogers passed away in November 2014, just 18 months after the attack. The police did not pursue additional charges for Dennehy for his murder, which I find odd. Sometimes in the UK, if someone later dies from an attack, then the offender can be charged with murder even years later if their death was linked to the injuries from the initial assault. I'd be surprised if the attack that John suffered did not have something to do with his death. Perhaps the police couldn't make a definitive link. Regardless, in my mind, Joanna Dennehy killed 4, not 3 people. Within minutes of stabbing John Rogers, the police apprehended Stretch and Dennehy, as all forces were already looking out for them for the murder of Kevin Lee, whose body had been found, but they were now linked to these 2 stabbings. Dennehy was taken to a police station, and this chilling footage shows her apparent indifference to her fate while she flirted with police officers.
Amazing.
Looks good.
Thanks, Matt. That makes me feel so good. Real sexy.
Shirt.
Not a t-shirt, it's a tent.
Joanne, signature from you that we've got your property.
Right, so what am I up for? Attempted murder and murder.
You've been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder and murder.
Could be worse.
I think this clip shows 2 things. Firstly, the complete lack of remorse or concern from Dennehy, with her acting like she's just been arrested for shoplifting, rather than the attempted murder of 2 people and the murder of 1 other, with her knowing that they would soon link her to a further 2. Also, I think it shows Dennehy's arrogance, manipulation and narcissism, with her default way of acting in any environment being a way to look to manipulate those around her to get what she wants. And she believes that, in this environment, somehow her fluttering her eyelids will get her special treatment. Dennehy was described as, quote, calm and cooperative during her police interview, but she gave little information. However, regardless of this, there was sufficient evidence to charge her with 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton were both charged with crimes related to assisting Joanna Dennehy in her offences. Joanna Dennehy was remanded into custody soon after arrest to await her day in court, but incarceration did not stop her plotting acts of violence. In September 2013, prison officers at H&P Bronzefield found an escape plot written in her diary. This plan involved killing or seriously injuring a prison officer, cutting off their finger, and using this to fool the biometrics in the prison to escape. Dennehy was placed in solitary confinement, and was produced for her court appearances under extremely high security. On the 18th of November 2013, at the Old Bailey in London, to the surprise of many, Joanna Dennehy pleaded guilty to all 3 murders and 2 counts of attempted murder. Gary Stretch was subsequently convicted after trial of 3 counts of preventing the lawful burial of a corpse and 1 count of attempted murder. His argument was that he was scared of Dennehy and had no choice but to help her. However, whilst awaiting the verdict in his trial, prison authorities intercepted letters between Stretch and Dennehy, which are frankly pathetic. In one of these he wrote, quote, "Right, stop blaming yourself for me being in this with you. It was my own choices, babe, 'cause I'm my own person. I can make up my own mind, so get off that trip." In another message he admits, quote, "Mad choices have been my undoing. It's not your fault. You did tell me to leave, but I never." He also promises, quote, "I'll do anything for you, which I've already proven to you. You are the one woman I ever truly loved." He signed the letter off as, quote, "Your personal undertaker." Now, I'm not a criminal genius, but I think it's probably pretty dim to write a letter that blows your entire defence out of the water. But this letter shows the continued pathetic, simpering loyalty that Gary Stretch had towards Joanna Dennehy, a woman his association with had destroyed his life. I wonder if, in the years since, Stretch has worked out just how meaningless he was to her, like everyone was in Dennehy's life, and he was just another mark used to get what she wanted. Anyway, Leslie Layton was found guilty of 2 counts of preventing the lawful burial of a body and 1 count of perverting the course of justice. Before sentencing, Joanna Dennehy was assessed by a psychiatrist, to whom she disclosed she had killed to see how it felt and, quote, "to see if I was as cold as I thought I was. Then it got moreish, and I got a taste for it." Dennehy said that she had absolutely no remorse for the murders, but oddly stated that she regretted the attempted murders of the 2 men she targeted at random. Dennehy was revelling in discussing her offending, and her statements were not just confined to the conversations with the psychiatrist. She also wrote a letter directly to the judge, saying that she had no remorse, but again claimed that she regretted the other 2 offences, something the judge utterly rejected. As well as having antisocial personality disorder and traits of psychopathy, Dennehy was assessed as being sadomasochistic, i.e. deriving pleasure both from the giving and receiving of pain. She would apparently also frequently watch violent pornography. On the 28th of February 2014, Joanna Dennehy, Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton appeared at the Old Bailey for sentencing before Mr. Justice Spencer. Dennehy was seen smirking in the dock as the judge delivered his sentencing remarks. With regards to her, Justice Spencer rejected any implication that she felt any remorse for any of her crimes, and he described her as, quote, "a cruel, calculating, selfish and manipulative serial killer." With regards to Gary Stretch, Justice Spencer said that, as opposed to being scared of Dennehy, he was a willing participant and he revelled in her criminality and the media attention the offences would bring. With Leslie Layton, the judge dispelled any claim that he'd made about being afraid or coerced into any of the behaviour he'd been convicted of, with him pointing out that when he came across the body of John Chapman, he did not panic or raise the alarm. Instead, he took a photograph on his phone as some sort of morbid keepsake. He then sentenced them. For the murders of Lukas Slabozewski, John Chapman and Kevin Lee, Joanna Dennehy was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning that she will never be released from prison. Gary Stretch was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 19 years before he can apply for parole. Leslie Layton was sentenced to 14 years imprisonment, of which he was to serve half in prison and the other half on licence in the community. Therefore, he was likely released from prison in around 2021. Gary Stretch, likely beginning to realise the enormity of his situation, appealed his sentence as too severe in November 2014. His appeal was promptly rejected. Joanna Dennehy has been busy in prison. In 2018, she was granted permission to marry her cellmate, Hayley Palmer, and the pair apparently tried to kill themselves in a suicide pact later that same year. Dennehy told Hayley that she had no regrets about the crime she committed. In May 2021, it was again reported that Dennehy and Hayley were planning to marry, with Hayley by this point having been released from custody. Hayley disclosed letters that she had been written by Dennehy, in which she stated, quote, "To me, you will never be anything other than real. The first person to creep under my skin. You have a fully committed psychopath." Dennehy has also apparently made threats to kill Rose West, but they are currently in separate prisons. Joanna Dennehy is an anomaly, both in terms of her gender and her background, with female serial killers making up less than 20% of all known serial murderers, and those who do kill multiple people often having backgrounds of often horrific abuse. However, there is no evidence of abuse in Dennehy's background. She apparently grew up in a loving and happy household. However, I think in this case it's potentially things that happen outside the home which is not disclosed, which are key to understanding the monster that Joanna Dennehy became. Specifically, it's recorded that Dennehy told people that she would not kill women or children, and she would only target men. I believe this was a twisted way of justifying the indefensible, but potentially gives an insight into her potential hatred of men, and that she felt that members of this gender were somehow fair game. A hatred of women has been speculated as being a motivating factor underpinning the murders of many male serial killers, including Ted Bundy and Levi Belfield, so potentially a hatred of men is a factor in the actions of some female serial killers. An obvious case is that of Eileen Wuornos, who had a history of being abused by males and who killed 7 men between 1989 and 1990 in Florida. If Dennehy did indeed have a hatred of men, I wouldn't be surprised if it had something to do with her wayward behaviour as a teenager, where she was drunk and high, and likely preyed upon by men who used her for their own purposes. This is unfortunately a common occurrence. There's a curious dichotomy with Dennehy, as, if she did indeed hate men, she also relied on them heavily to get what she wanted in her life. However, I don't think this meant she liked men. Potentially she saw those she came into contact with as weak and just a means to an end. Someone in my comments once mentioned about neurodevelopmental issues as potentially being linked to acts of violence and murder, and potentially this is true in the case of Dennehy. Perhaps there were issues in her brain development, which meant that areas linked to empathy and impulse control did not develop properly. These underlying issues would likely have been compounded by her heavy drug and alcohol use as a teenager, leading Joanna Dennehy to be a ticking time bomb, someone with no empathy, a propensity for violence, a lack of impulse control, and no remorse for her behaviour. It's also clear that sexual gratification played a part in Dennehy's offending, with her gaining sexual excitement from violence towards others. This is similar to many other cases. The one that springs to mind is Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Rostov Ripper, who killed at least 52 people between 1978 and 1990 in the Soviet Union. He was a man who gained sexual excitement from stabbing his victims to death, often to the point of orgasm. Whether anyone will ever understand Joanna Dennehy is unclear. She's been described as a pathological liar, so even if she told people the truth about how her issues started, would anyone believe her? Regardless, Joanna Dennehy will spend the rest of her life behind bars, and I'd be surprised if we've heard the last of her. So, what are your thoughts on the case of Joanna Dennehy? Why do you think she committed these offences? Do you think I'm in the right ballpark? I'm always interested in other people's points of view. Anyway, please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.